With the new school year beginning shortly and the end of the COVID-19 pandemic nowhere in sight, schools are now having to decide whether to reopen or stay closed. Many schools are choosing between sending all their students back, continuing remote learning, or a hybrid of the two choices. There are many factors to account for when making these decisions, such as economic benefits and detriments, and mainly, the health of students and the community. And so, in this debated video, we'll debate whether or not schools should reopen in the fall. We will discuss the socioeconomic effects, medical factors, as well as technological advantages and disadvantages. Before we continue, be sure to like, subscribe, and hit the bell button so you don't miss any of our new videos. Let's start. The question that first must be addressed is whether sending students to school is even safe. Now, many parents are rightfully concerned about the safety of sending their children to school. However, children themselves seem to be at a low risk of contracting the disease themselves, being responsible for only 7% of COVID cases. Even with those who contract it, COVID-19 is rarely fatal to them, with less than 0.1% COVID-related deaths of children. But that analysis is rather naive. The argument that children themselves aren't likely to get seriously ill from COVID fails to acknowledge that children can still transmit the disease. Back in March, schools were closed at 100 cases. Why did we close the schools? Well, our reasoning was that even if children aren't a susceptible group to COVID-19, they can still spread it to those groups who are at risk. The same reasoning we used then is even more important now, with 55,000 cases a day. It's not a matter of if, but a matter of when these students contract COVID, because it isn't a 0% avoidance rate. They will spread it to their families and everyone they come in contact with outside of school. The United States' delayed response to COVID-19 is what's caused its spread here. Reopening schools at the peak of the virus will cause cases to rise dramatically and make it harder to combat its spread. COVID-19 is obviously dangerous, but the mental health harms for not sending students to school is another disease that many argue should not be taken lightly. Schools play a critical role in supporting the social and emotional well-being of students. When a student is in school, they're connected to various people, giving them a sense of community. A study on the impacts of connectedness and social vulnerability found that being connected to community such as schools lowered depression and suicidal thoughts and raised self-esteem. When students learn from home, their social interaction is severely limited, which may lead to poor social and emotional health. Furthermore, in addition to the mental health impacts of such isolation, the lack of in-person learning can be detrimental to children who rely on school services for common mental health needs. According to the CDC, 4.4 million school-age children have diagnosed anxiety and 1.9 million have diagnosed depression. Many students can only access mental health help through their schools, but if these students can't go to school, they can't access help. So, what we have on the medical analysis is that even though COVID-19 isn't dangerous to students can still spread it. However, when we decide not to send students to school, we do it at the risk of their mental health. But let's consider the fact that prolonged COVID-19 has grave impacts on our economy, while these mental health impacts will only last as long as the pandemic does. As we discussed, sending students to school right now means prolonging the pandemic. The effects of COVID-19 on the economy right now, even with a potential COVID hotspot like schools closed, have been so devastating that we are receiving a second round of stimulus checks. The fact that we need a second round of those stimulus checks proves our economy is not ready to handle more COVID cases. When we open schools, we only prolong the dire economic effects of COVID. But when we don't send students to school and have them learn remotely, we can stop these economic downfalls and end the mental health crisis. But still, it can be argued that not sending students to school is bad for the economy too. In general, students do not learn as much when learning remotely as compared to when learning in a classroom. A survey conducted on students enrolled at college showed these results. As we can see from these charts, remote working hinders the ability of students to learn. Education is correlated with future income, with one study reporting that each year of education is corresponding with 9% increase in future earnings. But if students aren't learning as much, then they will not see as much of an increase in their future earnings. On the individual scale, this may seem very small, but when multiplied by the millions of students in the US, there should be a significant effect on the future economy. However, the scope of how much remote learning will affect the future economy is hard to determine. In richer areas, remote learning won't have as much of an impact on students' education because those areas have the necessary resources to offer a good e-learning experience, but rural or poor areas aren't as lucky. People living in rural areas are less likely to have internet access at home. A survey conducted in 2019 shows that roughly 1/3 of rural Americans don't have broadband internet connection at home. With everything going virtual due to COVID-19, some people have no choice but to drive far away and use free internet from the parking lots of restaurants and libraries for small tasks such as sending an email. This is already extremely inconvenient and will be impossible for many students if they are forced to do this every day for school. If school goes completely or partially online, these students are likely to fall behind and not perform as well as their peers who do have access to Wi-Fi. This further exacerbates the education gap between low-income students and wealthier students. Richer students have always had more access to services such as tutors for extra help, allowing them to perform generally better in school than students who cannot afford extra help. Not having an in-person setting may make it harder for students to get help from teachers. However, low-income students won't be able to get this help as easily as others will, which will further increase the already existing educational difference between the rich and the poor. So really, the debate centers around which we can trade off for the other. Can we trade off the health of the community for the mental health of students, which will have larger effects? Can we trade off the current economy for the future economy, especially that of rural areas? The answer to this question is going to differ from area to area. For an area with very low COVID cases, it makes more sense for them to choose to let their students go to school to ensure that students' mental health doesn't suffer and that their future economy isn't hurt by students learning less. But areas with high COVID levels should have their students learn remotely because otherwise their local economic problems will be prolonged as cases would inevitably rise. Sure, the mental health of students is important, but once COVID cases go down, those students can return. Thanks for watching this debated video. What is your opinion on sending students to school? If you're a student, are you going back to school in the fall? Let us know in the comments below, and don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you next time.